at 5 o'clock. That's probably your best option because we're going to eat during the Bible study. And during the Bible study, it's going to be some baked chicken, some green beans, a salad, and then we're having a dessert. But I don't want you to get too excited about that. It's just fruit, okay? But that helps us obey the rules of the Seder. Like if I was a kid and I came in and it was like, really, dessert is fruit? I'd be disappointed. So I'm just letting you know ahead of time. If you want a cookie, you got to eat that some other time because that doesn't fit with what they do. So we'll eat that, and then there's some words to follow up the meal, okay? If you're like, I don't want that, you could come up here early and eat Chick-fil-A if you wanted to, but then you're going to be full for the Seder meal, and so just know that. We're going to sit around tables. He's going to walk us through kind of the ceremonial part of it, and so it should be good. But that starts at 5:30. It's in the gym. If you wander in here at 6, you're just going to be early for choir practice, okay? And you're going to be late for Bible study. So we'll be in there 5:30. The meal portion will be around 6, but so you don't need to be in line for that. If you want to come and get dessert that's not fruit, maybe you could come early, eat your dessert first, and then come into the Seder meal and have fruit for dessert. Don't tell them I told you to do that. Yes? You don't have to register. We're not overly, you can invite people, so it's not like it's a closed group, but this is really just for us. It's kind of our thing. And so it also lets me and Mark walk through this together with a smaller group, and then if it goes well, we might expand it later. But really, we're walking through Exodus, and it fits really where we are. So it's going to fit perfectly with our Bible study. So you can invite people. If you're inviting a lot of people, please let me know, because we're planning for kind of just under 100. Okay, so that's really gives us plenty of growth room for what we normally have on Wednesday night. But it's really a thing for us, and you can invite people, but it's mainly for us. Yeah, so if you don't regularly participate in Wednesday night supper usually costs about $8. This is probably not $8 worth of supplies. So if you wanted to bring $5 and donate it to the cause, that'd be fine. But you don't have to. If you just want to participate, there's no real cost. But if you'd like to make a donation, you can. If you get here early and eat Chick-fil-A, you need to pay the $8 for the thing like that. Yes, this is how we're doing the Seder meal in his words, not my words. Kosher-ish. Okay, so we're not putting ham in the green beans, and it can't have any rolls. Like it has to be the matzah bread, but we're not totally worrying about making sure the kitchen and all that stuff. Like it's kosher-ish, just to give you kind of an idea of what it looks like. It's interesting. He grew up in a tradition that was kosher-ish. Like he says, I was strict kosher for the week of Passover, and the rest of life we were only sort of kosher. And so remember, there's just like there are different kind of Baptists, there's different kind of Jews. All right, if you need a sheet of paper and notes, we're going Exodus 21 through 23. We are really covering a great number of laws tonight. So I even originally had more that we were going to cover in the way I originally split out the outline, and then I thought we will never get through all of this. So we're going to try to just do 21 through 23. So remember, we finished the 10 Commandments last week. And then really, when it began with the discussion of the idols and the altars, that section onward is often called the Book of the Covenant. And so it's kind of more specific laws. So this is really so notice in verse 22 that the Lord said to Moses. Okay, so remember in the 10 Commandments, the Lord just says. He's really saying it to all the people. And that terrifies everybody, understandably so. And then in verse 22 of chapter 20, it says, and then the Lord said to Moses. And so that kind of delineates a new section. And that section is often called the Book of the Covenant. It actually extends beyond what we're covering today, but it kind of starts that section. All right, so chapter 21 says, these are the laws you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is free to go alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to the master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door of the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the right. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. All right, so we'll stop there. Right away, this section causes a lot of modern people understandable questions. It feels very strange that we find ourselves in a story about God liberating the Hebrew children from slavery, and then the very first instructions following the Ten Commandments are what?
About slavery.
How to treat slaves. So the NIV really is probably, to translate it servant is probably a little light. Right? This servant is not free to go. And if you're a servant who is not free to go, what are you? You're a slave. So a better translation is a slave. And here it is helpful to think that this is primarily talking about what we might later consider indentured servanthood. Okay, now we don't necessarily want indentured servanthood in the world today, but it is a little bit different kind of slavery than just enslaving people because you've captured them in battle or something else. So these are folks who likely owe debts, and so they are simply selling their working life to help pay off those debts. What is significant about this is, unlike many other cultures in the day, there are strict limits put on how much you could demand from somebody, no matter their debt, right? It doesn't say here, if their debt is this much, you don't have to follow these rules. So no matter the debt, how long are they allowed to work for you before you have to set them free? And let's clarify first, a man. We're talking about a male slave at this point.
6 years, and in the seventh they set him free.
Yeah, 6 years, and then in the seventh you have to set him free. I don't know if that's on day one or just sometime in the seventh year, but sometime you got to set him free. You're going to see a rhythm here, right, of 6 days, 6 years of work, and then whatever kind of, if it's days, then we're going to have a rest day, and if it's years, we're going to have a rest year. So it's following this pattern. So there's a clear limit to how long someone can be enslaved, right? The slavery is not to be the perpetual state of anyone. And so here, that is set up in this way. Female slaves are different, and we have to really think of this in a totally different way. What really is happening here is what's really called a female slave in here is really more like this person is being betrothed to the master because of some sort of debt. Now, this understandably rubs us all wrong, and it should. In all of these passages we read, we have to remember, we read the Old Testament in light of the New, and especially in light of the revelation of who God is in Jesus Christ. So it's okay for us to read these passages and say, man, I don't like this at all. Now, we also have to remember it's a totally different day and age and a totally different culture with totally different circumstances of what does it mean to survive in that world. And so if I'm indebted and in poverty, there's not a Walmart that I can go to and apply for a job, okay? So this is in some ways a form of cultural welfare. It's a stopgap to keep people from really becoming beggars. So it is, as much as it seems a world that we do not want to live in and we do not want to perpetuate, it is a world in which this is actually providing people and preventing them from becoming completely impoverished. Because you're going to see in the rest of the law that slaves are to be treated fairly and they're not treated completely as property in Israel, which is very different than the other law codes of that day. So slaves have more rights in Israel than they do in other cultures of their day. So here, right, the reading on the woman is, if you're not going to end up marrying her, she needs to be allowed to either go back to her family or redeemed by her family. You're not allowed to sell her to some other person or some other group of people. And so, again, that's really a lot of the language about women in this passage. The whole section we're reading is we're gonna think, man, that's terrible. But again, in that culture, in just a normal setting, if I have a daughter and is the daughter gonna have a whole lot of say in this culture about who she marries? No, she's going to be really given by the father to someone else. But they actually, even just a regular marriage, that person is going to have to pay a bride price for that person. So essentially here, if somebody owes a debt, what they're doing is saying, you can marry my daughter without the bride price. So essentially, I'm paying off my debt. You're basically trading me the bride price to pay off my debt, and I'm giving you my daughter. Does that make sense in the sense of, is that good? But does that make sense in that it's clear you understand what I'm saying? Okay. Again, all of these instructions cause us to just think, what in the world? Yep.
There's a similar passage in Deuteronomy addressing the same thing.
A lot of times, and it's a good point. So here's something that I think is hard for us to wrap our minds around. Because, right, these laws are from God to Moses. And I think we tend to think of them as, if God gives us a law, that law is what? We might think unchanging forever. But that is not the way the Mosaic law functions in the Old Testament. That there are times throughout the Old Testament where certain aspects of the law get altered. So it is really thinking the 10 Commandments are 10 principles that kind of guide the really character of the nation. The rest of these laws are going to be laws that help Israel live differently than their neighbors, but they actually are up for change a little bit. So that you're going to get in Numbers some daughters who argue that limiting the inheritance to the sons is unfair, and that their father was faithful and they should get their inheritance. And the law gets changed. And so, again, I think sometimes we bring assumptions about these things. It makes sense from our perspective that God says this and so it can never change. But that's not the way the Old Testament handles a lot of these laws. So in Deuteronomy, it's addressing some of these things. Also, you're going to get cases as goes through in Deuteronomy, like life happens. And you say, well, it didn't specifically tell us what to do in this instance. And so then there has to be interpretations and adjustments. One of those, as we're going to get to it, is as simple as eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. We don't really have any evidence that if some guy poked some other guy's eye out, that they held that guy down and poked his eye out. Like, it seems like very quickly that translates into some judge determining what's the monetary value of that eye worth, and you got to pay that for it. But we're going to get there in a second. All right, yep.
As a genealogist, this is a little bit different than what we saw in the U.S. And as you read wills, you read, it's like buying and selling cattle. You buy it, you got it, you got all of the jet and everything from then on, and you can do whatever you want to with them. But that's a lot different than what our slavery was here.
Yeah, so he's speaking about kind of American slavery, and we often see that through the lens of American slavery because it's what we're most familiar with. Very different, only treated as property, right? If you killed your slave for no reason, we're going to get to that in a second. We're going to get to those kind of laws. That's really not this. This is different. Now, that doesn't mean we want to live in this world. We don't want to live in a world where people are in debt and we sell them into slavery. But it still is. This is a more limited form of slavery than what we experienced here in America.
In a way, I see this as protection for the women. You know, because she can't just be sold to anybody. She's somewhat protected. Yes, she is a slave, but at least she has.
Yeah, we will see in the Old Testament, the women don't have nearly the kind of rights or independence that we would think is appropriate in life. But that's across the board in the Old Testament. So this really is, she's not really being sold into slavery like the man is. It really is more along the lines of, like I said, it is, you're not going to owe the bride price because I already owe you money. that we're going to negate my debt, and you're not going to have to pay me the bride price in order for my daughter to become your bride. Because notice here, if the guy isn't going to marry her, he has to give her back, basically. And so, again, this rubs all of us the wrong way. That's okay. We're reading about something from thousands of years ago, because it's going to get even stranger a little later. So we'll keep going. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. So here we have very quickly this idea that life matters. So throughout the Old Testament, right? I mean, 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder, right? And so life matters in it. And to kill someone is a gross violation of really God's own image, because that person is made in God's image. And so it's taken very seriously. So very early here, we have this evidence of capital punishment for murder. Now, it also still is valuing the life of someone who finds themselves inadvertently in a really difficult situation. So we might, consider it a manslaughter. So manslaughter, a person still may be at fault, right, for doing something that led to the death of another. But if there is judged no intention to kill, the punishment is not death, which just in any sort of world where people are just allowed to do what they want. If you kill somebody in my family, even accidentally, what does my family probably want to do to someone in your family? Right? Kill them. It's the Hatfield and McCoys, right? I mean, it's just over and over. So this is a significant limitation on punishment. That if there's no intention to commit murder, there's still a form of punishment. This is a kind of banishment. But there are cities of really peace, of safety, where this person can flee, and they have to live out their days there. I think it's later in Deuteronomy. If they leave, they can be killed. But if they stay there, then they have the protection of that city. It is, again, we're going to see throughout this chapter what can feel like really harsh language to us. It's actually limitations on revenge. So throughout these laws, it is really a limitation on how much punishment we can actually mete out when somebody has offended us. It has to fit the crime, so to speak, is what we would say. And so, but there is a significant concern about life. And so it takes this seriously. We don't want to live in a world where people don't value life. And so that's set up here. Verse, chapter 15 is going to get even a little. So here, if you attack your father or mother, you're to be put to death, capital punishment. So we're going to see here in a second, even if you curse, let's go ahead and read it. So 15, if anyone attacks their father and mother, they are to be put to death. 16, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. And 17, anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. So capital punishment here extends to, let's just talk about mom and dad first. If you attack them, which again, it's a great affront to kind of the order and structure of the family and society, but also it's almost like attempted murder, right? You're attacking them, things could go wrong, and so that person is to be put to death. For us, what gets strange is if you curse your mom and dad, you are to be put to death. Now this doesn't, like every teenager. So here it's not you said a bad word under your breath about your mom and dad. We have to remember what it means to curse someone in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, to curse someone is not to grumble at them, even with a bad word. It is to call death down upon them. And in the ancient world, they believed that was effective. So, right, there's a whole reason why later in these laws, they're going to have people take oaths of whether they have told the truth or not, because they lived in a world where they believed if you made an oath before God, essentially saying, if I'm lying, may God strike me dead. They thought that was an effective thing. Like if you went over there and died, we know you're a liar because God struck you dead. And so to call a curse down upon your parents isn't just to wish them dead. It is, in their culture, it means the same as attempted murder. And so it's a very serious offense. Now, we shouldn't curse our parents in any sort of way, but again, this is a very, it's more serious in their culture than what it sounds like to us. And so they're to be put to death. If you kidnap someone, so here it's still this idea of there's something about, our very lives that have dignity and worth before God, and to interfere in that in any significant way is an affront to God's own personhood. We offend God when we do that. So it's mindful here. It's not just, am I murdering somebody, but am I preventing them in some significant way through my own evil actions from being the person that God intends for them to be, right? If I've kidnapped somebody, they're in a family that loves them and cares for them, and now I'm whisking them away in this instance to be a slave or something else. And so, right, according to this, all of Joseph's brother would have deserved what? Death. That's right. All right, let's keep going. 18, if people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist and the victim does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, so if you have a fight but you're not too bad, you're okay. If the guilty party, however, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss and see that the victim is completely healed. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Okay, so for us, we think, man, they shouldn't be beating them anyway. But here, this is a limit to what other cultures would say. So other cultures, if the slave is your slave, they are your property completely, and it's within your right to kill them. But that's not the case in Israel, right? You cannot do that. You can discipline them and punish them, obviously beyond what we would think is appropriate, but there are limits. And we'll talk at the end of all this how this applies to our life. So I'm not saying any of this applies to our life, but in their culture, these are steps that are putting limitations on kind of the evil done in the world compared to their neighbors. All right, 22. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, and that really means the woman or the child, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you should take life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for a wound, bruise for a bruise. So here we see even the unborn life is considered of the same value as the life. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So we see here the previous verses are really disturbing to us that they're even allowed to beat them. But if beating caused real harm, there's to be compensation even to the point of setting the slave free. 28, if a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and the meat must not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has a habit of goring, and the owner has been warned but has not kept it pinned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner is also to be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. If anyone uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal in exchange. If anyone's bull injures someone else's bull and it dies, the two parties are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it pinned up, the owner must pay animal for animal and take the dead animal in exchange. All right, I always joke about those verses we don't cross-stitch and put on a pillow. These would be almost all of these, right? We have to remember this is language for a community, and when you live together, things happen, good and bad, and you end up with rules. Any ministry you've ever served with, they have rules, and I'm guaranteeing you most of those rules weren't there when the ministry started. But the rules get put in place over time as people do what? Stupid things, that's right. And so we have to have a way of organizing that. What we get here is this principle of not only am I responsible for my own actions towards others, I'm also responsible for managing my own household in such a way that it doesn't harm others. So that if my property, in this case predominantly bulls and pits, creates problems for other people, I have a responsibility to my neighbor. So, and we get this, right? We have rules in our own communities about if you have a dog and it gets out and harms somebody else or things like that. And so this is that kind of language. It just also reminds us that the value of life is important to God, and we're to conduct ourselves. It's not just about I'm not a murderer, but do I live responsibly in life in ways that help prevent harm to my neighbors? That's an important part of being. Christians should constantly be thinking, how do I live my life in a way that doesn't unintentionally bring harm on my neighbor? The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, burn for a burn, all that's called the lex talionis. It actually shows up in some other codes of law that's not unique to Jewish life, but it is considered a limitation on revenge. So while again it sounds very violent to us that you would gouge somebody's eye out, it's a limitation saying punishments must fit the crime. So if somebody gouges my eye out and I'm just acting out of my own sense of justice, what am I likely to do in return? Chop their head off.
That's going a little too far.
I mean, frankly, if we're just saying, just how did you fight with your brother and sister growing up, right? If they did something to you, I doubt you did exactly the same thing to them back. You always usually did the same thing back with a little bit more oomph. That's human nature. But if everybody gives a little bit more back with a little more oomph, what happens? Yeah, eventually, we've got all-out war. And so this is a limitation. It means the punishment must fit the crime. And really, again, what history teaches us is this very quickly translates into financial restitution for injuries done. And so you just like our court system, I don't know, hopefully you've never had to deal with this, but there is certain ways of thinking through if somebody loses an arm in an accident, this is how much arms are worth. I know that sounds weird to us, but that's the way it works, and eyes and all sorts of things to figure out what should be the proper compensation for those. Now, right, that's in many ways a certain thing. If there's negligence, our whole court system has built into it also the opportunity for certain kind of punitive damages, right? So if damages that are simply based on what should be the proper reimbursement, not reimbursement is the wrong word, proper response to this kind of energy. But then if we think somebody's being negligent, we put on top of that punitive damages, and you get some of that in here too. If there's intention, malintent, that's another sort of thing. All right, let's keep on moving. Now we're moving away from injury to property law. Lawyers may be thrilled about all this. For most of us, our eyes kind of glaze over. Chapter 22. Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of camel for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in it, so let's stop there. So if you steal something, right, that's a violation. It's a moral violation. And so it's not just you got to give it back, because you can't always give it back, right? Especially if you already killed it and ate it or sold it. But what do you have to do? You have to give back that and more. This actually goes all the way back to kind of Zacchaeus, right? He's stolen money, and so he's needing to give back not just what he stole, but what he stole and more. So this is, even anytime we do a wrong, it is this idea of to make a wrong right often requires more than what the actual offense was, if there was malintent, right? This is not, what we were talking about before were really accidents. This is really, I'm a thief. I've stolen what isn't mine. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck by a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. This is a challenging word for us. So here you've got a thief at night, and the threat is greater at night. And so if you are allowed in the law, God's law, to defend yourself, if it's at night and that defense leads to the death of a thief, you are not guilty of bloodshed. But this is strong and challenging language. If it's during the daytime and it leads to death, what you are guilty of bloodshed. Now, it's hard for us to sort out exactly what this means, except it does mean God is not giving us free rein to defend our property in ways that bring harm, even to the people who are trying to bring harm to us. We think of Jesus' strong language of turning the other cheek and all those things, but even in the Old Testament, which we so often think of as being completely harsh, this says we have a responsibility to really be present in our lives in such a way that even when we're defending what is ours, we do so in a way that attempts to reduce the harm that defense causes to even the people who are trying to do us harm. That's a challenging word, isn't it? But it's built here even in the Old Testament. That's not just a New Testament idea. Next verse, anyone who steals must certainly make restitution, but if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay for their theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, they must pay back double. So here's this idea. If I don't have any money, I may become enslaved to help pay off that debt. If anyone grazes their livestock in a field or a vineyard and lets them stray and they graze in someone else's field, the offender must make restitution from the best of their own field or vineyard. So not only do you got to pay them back, but there's no like, oh, you get to go feed in this part of my field, which is the bad part of the field. What do you got to do? You got to give them the best. If a fire breaks out and it spreads into the thorn bushes so that it burns shocks of grain or standing grain or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. If anyone gives a neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges, and they must determine whether the owner of the house has laid hands on the other person's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which somebody says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to the other. All right, so think twice about watching over your neighbor's stuff. But it's just ordinary life stuff, isn't it? Sometimes we think of the Bible being kind of high-minded. This is the ordinary stuff of life.
Taylor, the King James called it stuff. It says stuff to keep in the King James.
Stuff to keep. That's probably pretty. Stuff doesn't ever feel like a high and mighty word, but now that I know the King James uses it. If anyone gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to their neighbor for safekeeping, so this is kind of the same thing, it dies or is injured, is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. But if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, restitution must be made to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the neighbor shall bring in the remains as evidence and shall not be required to pay for the torn animal. If anyone borrows an animal from their neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, they must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. All right, so all this to say, all right, you got to have rules in a community. And here you also get this sense that sometimes decisions are hard to be made, and there are to be judges that make those decisions. And for the community to thrive, what has to happen after a judge makes a decision? You got to abide by it, right? It's just in here. Like, we're not, just because of the way life works, sometimes, sometimes there are court cases where one party is being deceitful and the other party is not. A lot of court cases, and I would say probably most of them, both parties think they are right. And they're having to bring it before a judge to decide something. And again, for society to function well, if a judge makes a decision, the community has to abide by it. And so the law is putting together the community in such a way that says, if we're going to be able to live together well, we have to abide by these rules. Now, in a perfect world, we would never accidentally kill anybody's goat or have sinful thoughts that lead to murder. But in a broken world, we have to have these kind of rules. All right, social responsibility. This next section is, again, modern people always think, what in the world? If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If a father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. All right, so here again, this is a different world, a different culture. There will be other laws that address kind of forced sexual behavior, but this is more of seduction. But here, if a father finds this out in this culture, he has acted towards her as if he was married towards her. So the then consequence of that is he is now married to her. He must pay the bride price, and he is married. Now, again, all of us thinking, what if she doesn't want to be married to him? There is at least here, it's not put in her hands, but if the father refuses, he still has to do what? Pay the bride price. Again, this is in a culture where women had very few options except to either be under the care of her father or under the care of her husband. And again, if that makes you bristle, well, the Bible is a big book. We'll get to different places later on, but this is where it starts. And so again, it's an attempt to protect really the welfare of the woman, even if it's not how we would do it today. Then we got three things that qualify for capital punishment. They may not be what qualify for capital punishment today. Do not allow a sorceress to live. So this really goes back to kind of, we see sorcerers in Egypt. These are people who are attempting to manipulate the gods through magic, and that's an affront to God's sovereignty. They are to be put to death. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal is to be put to death. That may have been a part of some of the pagan practices, some other things, but it certainly violates God's created order. And then whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. So in Israel, idolatry is worthy of the death penalty. And so again, remember, these laws are for God's people. And so this is in line with trying to have I want to be careful using the language country, because we think of countries. Israel as God's people, of what they were to follow. Equally challenging for our modern day conversations. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. So in every culture and every day, those who are not from there, are not part of the people, become vulnerable, and you're going to see a lot of protection for foreigners throughout the law of Israel. And why are they supposed to do that? Because they are to remember they were once what? Foreigners. Because remember, in Egypt, they don't start off as slaves. They're actually just foreigners. But over time, they get made slaves because they can become an easy scapegoat for Pharaoh. Okay, do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, they cry out to me. I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. Talk about strong language. Right here, if you take advantage of widows and orphans, what does God promise that he's going to do? Yeah, he's going to make your family a family full of widows and orphans. That's very strong language. So we do start to get here God's kind of special care for the vulnerable, for the most vulnerable. So foreigners, widows, orphans, these fall in that category. We're going to see in just a second that God doesn't want us to be impartial. So sometimes we talk about God's favor for the poor, and that's understandable throughout the text in passages like this. But God is also against showing partiality to the poor over and against the rich. So he's not for a world where people are where we tilt justice one way or the other, right? He's for a world where justice is justice. But he is always measuring that, or always accompanying that desire for justice with compassion towards the vulnerable. So there are lots of protection for the vulnerable in Israel's law, but it's not that we're going to all of a sudden pull the scales down and pretend like the rich people are inherently evil. That's not what he's doing. But it is saying the rich have a responsibility to show compassion for and to the poor, and anyone who takes advantage of the poor, and widows and orphans would have fit in that category, or the foreigners, that taking advantage of vulnerable people, to put it in very much of a prayer phrase, if you want to know what makes God really mad, that makes God really mad. Taking advantage of people who don't have as much ability to protect themselves as other people. God doesn't want us to take advantage of anybody. So he gets mad anytime we take advantage of somebody, but he gets really mad if we take advantage of those who are most vulnerable. Okay. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? And when they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. So again, this is about taking advantage of the poor. So if somebody's really in need and you loan them money, it's saying no interest. I mean, it's really saying you're not to take advantage of them. It's certainly against kind of modern day, we might say like payday loan lending, those kind of things really run against the grain of these kind of scriptures, that we're not to take advantage of people in their poverty. And really what it describes here is if you're taking their kind of last piece of clothing for collateral, at the end of the day, what do you got to do? Whether they've paid you back or not, you got to give it back. So this idea of so this is a challenge for us. We live in a kind of culture where if it's not illegal, there's a lot of businesses that they'll press that to the very end. But in God's law, just because we could do something doesn't mean we should do it. That we really should not press our advantage to the point of really destituting someone. That runs against the grain of what God wants for his people. Let's keep going. Because notice his impulse here. These people will, when they are destitute, they will cry out to me, and I will have compassion on them. So we have to think about that. I mean, throughout the scripture, it's like when the poor cry out to God for help, he listens. And when he comes to rescue them, you don't want to be the person who's holding on to their last piece of clothing, right? Because God's going to show up and say, why is this person naked in the street? And if you're there holding their last piece of clothing, that's not a good place to be, right? You're basically standing in the position of Pharaoh, and we know what God did to Pharaoh. So you don't want to be standing in that place, is basically what this passage says. Keep going. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. You are to be my holy people. So do not eat the meat of an animal torn by a wild beast. Throw it to the dogs. Okay, so these are more kind of cultic. It's about really obeying God's religious laws. But here, remember, these laws are for God's people. It's not for some secular society. This is for God's people. And part of being God's people is to obey God's commandments. You're not to be idolaters. You're not to blaspheme God. Even the ruler of your people here, curse them. Again, cursing is what? It's not just grumbling. I don't think God's against grumbling.
God's name in vain.
Yeah, it's wishing they were dead. It's really calling on for their death. And so, and again, the whole thing about meat of an animal torn by wild beasts, this kind of comes into the kosher laws that we're going to see later on. All right, laws of justice and mercy. Do not spread false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. So we just want to highlight this real quick, right? So he's saying, don't lie, don't manipulate, don't bear false witness, basically. This is kind of a living out of that commandment. Don't bear false witness against the neighbor. But it's interesting here. He's saying, don't even do this in defense of a poor person. So it's this idea of you may even feel like you're among the oppressed group, and your goal is to get at, those fat rich cats over there. But God is saying, don't follow the crowd in manipulating your testimony, even in defense of a poor person. It's like you're to always do what? Tell the truth. So this is an important lesson for us. Even when we think the cause is just, does that justify deceit according to these Old Testament laws? It does not.
In
So-
Proverbs, that's one of the 7 deadly sins, a lying witness that cannot be trusted.
That's right. So a lie, he says in the 7 deadly sins in the book of Proverbs, a lying tongue that cannot be trusted or witness. So it's a big deal. Like, we're called to tell the truth. Jesus is going to simplify a lot of this because he says you need to let your yes be what?
Yes.
Yes, and your no, no. Now, sometimes in our modern culture, we just talk too much, right? One of the ways to not lie as much is just don't talk as much. You don't have to say everything that ever comes in your head. But it is, if we're going to say something, it needs to be truthful. And even when we have important causes, deceit, in God's view, cannot be used to advance even important causes. Okay. If you come across, this is verse 4, if you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it. This is big. We always think love of enemy is totally a New Testament concept. That's not. Right here, this is not if you see your neighbor's donkey wandering off. It's if you see your enemy's donkey. And this is a law, right? So you are actually morally at fault if you see your enemy's donkey wandering off and you do not assist. That's a hard law, isn't it? It's not just don't do harm. It's when you see an obvious need for help, you are to do what? Help, even if it's your enemy. Strong language. Do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. So here, beforehand, we're not just to lie to help the poor people, but we're certainly not to deny justice to people because they're poor. Have nothing to do with false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. So again, strong emphasis here on the care of the foreigner. Big words about justice here, right? Is it always easy in life to figure out what is just? It's not, is it? And we have lots of arguments about what is just. And a lot of times the arguments we have with one another about how should society be organized, all of those manner of things, those are all attempts to figure out how do we forward the cause of justice in a world that is very unjust. And they're just not always easy answers there. But as God's people, we are to seek justice. I remember hearing this from a wonderful professor of mine at A&M, Dr. Rick Rigsby. Some of you have actually seen Dr. Rick Rigsby in a video because one of his commencement address went viral about 10 years ago. But Dr. Rigsby is kind of a giant African-American man, and when I was at A&M, he was the life coach for the football team, which meant he was just trying to keep him out of trouble, I think. But he was also a very talented communication professor, and I took him for several communication classes. And so, I obviously grew up white and, did not have the experience of an African-American living in America. And we did a lot about talking. I took him for all sorts of courses. So I took some pop culture courses, rhetoric of pop culture. Talk about a class that doesn't sound like a real class, but it's studying how we communicate messages in pop culture and all sorts of things. And we were just talking about how different messages about race and different things, and really helped me understand something from a perspective that just was not a part of my upbringing, right? Talking about how, almost all of us at this point, if we have any kind of insight in our life at all, will acknowledge that our culture was tilted unfairly against African Americans in our culture. And he says, so it's like we were playing a baseball game, and for 7 innings, one team was cheating completely. And the score is like 35-0. And then they get to the 7th inning and they go, well, you know what? We have been cheating. We're not going to cheat anymore, but we're also not going to adjust the score. Does that feel like a fair game? And he says, for many African Americans, that's what our culture feels like. And that made a lot of sense. But then, of course, when you weren't the people who were alive in that part, what does justice look like? And can we just say, what does justice look like? That's a hard question to answer. And we might have different answers. And really, almost all of our attempts to find justice in this life, what I've discovered as broken human beings is every time we think we're figuring out justice, what does it feel like to somebody else? Injustice. But these scriptures say, as far as it is up to us, what should we be striving for? Justice. And justice for me, justice for the poor person, justice for the rich person, justice for the foreigner, justice for everybody. And it means I have to be willing to say, one, I have to be willing to tell the truth, even when the truth is maybe a little bit indicting of me. And then this community sense of we're in it together, so what does that look like? And again, don't leave here saying Taylor's for this or Taylor's for that. I don't have good answers for this, but at least acknowledging we live in an unjust world, and trying to figure out how to live justly is very challenging. And we shouldn't throw up our hands. We should work towards it, but some of that is helping listen to other people and say, what does justice feel like to you? Because we come from different perspectives, and it feels different ways. And sometimes our eyes need to be opened to the perspective of another. All right, Sabbath laws. For 6 years, you are to sow your fields and harvest and harvest the crops. But during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Be careful to do everything I have said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. So Sabbath was not just to be a day in Israel, it was to be a principle. So Sabbath weekly means there's one day of the week where we do what? No work. Yeah, we rest, but the commandment is do no work. And it's not just you don't do any work. Who else is not supposed to do any work? Anybody who works for you. Your servant, your slave, nobody's supposed to work. So it's not like you get away with not working by making everybody else work for you. This is to be community-wide, no working. But there's also this principle that even nature itself is to allow times of rest. So even your fields, you're to work them for 6 years, but then on the 7th year, it's to do what? Yeah, rest. We want to say lie fallow. And it's interesting, if anything grows, because I guess if you've been planting stuff there, something might pop up. And can you go out there and say, well, I didn't work for it, I can go harvest it? Do you get to harvest it? No, what are you supposed to do?
Leave it for others.
Leave it for others. And the others include the foreigners, widows, orphans, even the animals, right? We're going to let them have some of it. You think that might drive some people a little bit crazy, just to let it be like that, but that's part of it. We don't know if this meant that they were to do all of this at once. So it meant once a year they were just supposed to let all the fields lie fallow, or if they alternated it. So maybe it's, they had it such so that maybe 1/7 of their property was lying fallow at any given time. It doesn't give us all those details. But this is part of it. You're later going to get kind of commandments on the year of Jubilee, where it's, this massive allowing of things to go free and people to go free and returning of property, but it's to be built in. And so for us, even in our lives, what does it mean for Sabbath to happen in our lives? What does it mean for us to not always be at work? But then also, how can we live our lives in such a way so that not everybody is always having to work for us? So maybe even thinking through how do we structure our lives in such a way where we aren't always making demands on someone else every day of every week. Are we allowing the people in our lives time for rest in every area? This is hard in a culture that no longer obeys the Sabbath, right? So there is no Sabbath anymore. And so what does it look? And even church, I'll just be honest, if you volunteer for us in any capacity, Sunday may not be a great rest day. Sunday is not a great rest day for me. And so I do my very best to Sabbath on, really honestly, on Thursday. It's my day off. And people are like, why do you take Thursday off? And I will tell you why I take Thursday off. I found I can be really good at ignoring you for 24 hours. Right? If I just try to let's say I took Friday off, so that means, I'm out Friday, I'm out Saturday. But if you call me, I'm not going to ignore you for 2 days, right? I'm going to be a bad pastor if I ignore you for 2 days. And so for me, it just works better. I take off Thursday. People are, Thursdays, I don't know what y'all are doing on Thursdays, but people don't tend to need me on Thursdays. And it gives me just a day to not be working. Now, I may do some other things that are more restful for me. So, right, in this for our lives, I don't mow my grass anymore. But if I were mowing my grass, like, it's different enough from my work that it doesn't feel like work. So I may work in my garden. So I don't do Sabbath like the Jews did Sabbath, where they literally can't flip a light switch. For us, it's what is restful for your soul? Where you're not working in a sense to try to get ahead, to try to make a name for yourself. And so that's part of it. But then even what are the rhythms of our life? Sabbath, we can think through Sabbath in a weekly sense, but also maybe how do we think of Sabbath in seasons of life? Like what are maybe every 7 years, what would it look like for us to disengage from certain projects? At our last church, we forced volunteers to take time off every now and then. So what does it look like for us to even set up church life in such a way that we don't just wear you to the bone, right? We give you seasons of rest. So that's part of it. In the last section, 3 annual festivals. 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread. This is the Passover. For 7 days, eat bread made without yeast. And as I commanded you, do this at the appointed time in the month of Aviv. For that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your field. So this is the very beginning of harvest, and you're to bring your first fruits. Celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year. So this is the end of the harvest when you gather in your crops from the field. 3 times a year, all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. So these are pilgrim festivals. The men are most supposed to make these pilgrimages to worship the Lord. Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. The fat of my festival offerings must not be kept until morning. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. So all those are kind of precursors to what we're going to get in the rest of the Levitical law about worship. But it tells us, for the people of God, right, living well involves both the ordinary ways that we treat each other and seek justice in our world, but also the way we worship the Lord. Now, all of this is going to get transformed in the New Testament, and one of the challenges for us is, how do these Old Testament laws apply to our lives today? Because in this room, we're not observing these festivals at the end. It doesn't become a part of Christian tradition. There's certain laws that we don't follow at all. But should we be a people who are still concerned about justice? Yeah. Does being set free by grace mean we can lie if we ever get summoned to a court case? No, we're telling the truth. So it's challenging, but here kind of the moral principles of the Old Testament law, especially as they get interpreted through the person of Jesus Christ. Let's just think about the Beatitudes. Does Jesus Christ tend to make these things easier or more difficult? Yeah, more difficult. He says, you heard it was said, an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, but he says what? He doesn't just say, if you see your enemy's donkey wandering away, go help it. He says, you got to love your enemy. You got to pray for those who persecute you, right? Seek their well-being. And so all sorts of things he makes more difficult. But it's an interesting way. I think sometimes we think he's upending the Old Testament. He's really not. Those principles are already here, aren't they? He's upending people who have misinterpreted the principles of the law. And he's saying this is what the law was supposed to point towards: a life that seeks justice, a life that shows mercy. And he lives that out. He's the only one, of course, who lives that out in full.
He says clearly that he didn't come to abolish it.
That's right. He came to fulfill it, not to abolish it. That's right. All right. Well, yes, Jerry. Yeah, we got to love our neighbors as ourselves. Jesus is going to sum that up as the summary of the law. And it's an easier thing to say than to do, isn't it? To think of our neighbor and to think, how do I think about their welfare and not just my own? But Jesus calls us to that. One of the things you got to do is talk to your neighbor. I think a lot of times we assume what our neighbor would want, but we don't actually talk to them to ask them. And so, especially on all manner of issues, as we think through how do we live out justice in the world, I think that's one of the things. It's easy to think about justice from our perspective, but if we really want to seek justice in the world, we're probably going to have to talk to people from a variety of backgrounds. Because if we want justice, we would certainly want somebody to take our opinion of what would be fair. And if so, we're trying to work our way towards fair decisions in life. It probably means we have to listen to other people's opinions as well. Probably one of the hardest things in the world, isn't it? I mean, when my wife and I get in a fight, I always know what I think justice looks like. But she doesn't always agree with me. And we have to find somewhere in the middle. Or sometimes she's right and I'm wrong. And on very few other cases, it might go the other direction. Let me say a prayer for us and we'll be dismissed. Lord, we thank you that you have given us clear guidelines about what you expect from us. Most basic is that we are to tell the truth. We are to care for our neighbor, no matter who they are or where they come from. Lord, even if they're our enemy, even if they seek to harm us, we are to live our lives in such a way that we seek their welfare. And that doesn't mean we turn a blind eye to their evil doing, but it does, Lord, mean that we do everything that we can, Lord, to show them your love and your care. And Lord, we know this is much easier said than done. And so we pray that you would give us wisdom and courage, Lord, to really practice this every day of our lives. Lord, we know that we live in a culture right now where there is a lot more heat than light. And so, Lord, we pray that you would help us to be people who, in the everyday relationships of our lives, model the principles of your kingdom, which, Lord, even show up in small ways right here in the Old Testament, but, Lord, which we most fully see in our Savior, Jesus Christ. Lord, so give us wisdom and give us courage for these days. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, next week, if you came in late, 5:30 in the gym, we're going to have a Seder meal, sort of. We're going to walk through what a Seder meal looks like. It won't be a perfect Seder meal, but it's going to help us kind of see what was commanded in Exodus, how it still gets lived out today among our Jewish friends, and how it applies and points us to Jesus. So hope to see you next week, 5:30 in the gymnasium.
These are the extras.
Oh, thank you.
Good job. That's a complicated thing to cover. I would hate to be covering that. I don't know how you reduced it down to just 2 pages.
Yeah, got a lot of stuff. I don't know.
Do some work, do that.